Hello, welcome. Thank you very much for tuning in. My name is David Curran, and I'm going to tell you a story today about how I created some visualizations, why I created visualizations, and hopefully to encourage you to go off and make some nice, pretty graphs. Okay, so that there, does anyone recognize it? It might come obvious in a few minutes what it is. So the fancy title for this is Visualizing Trends in the Loudness of Popular Music. What it's actually about is how to make graphs, where to put them online, and why you should do it. Okay. Okay. Great. So, making two arguments. First of all, well, a few arguments. First thing is the best way to learn is by going out there and doing stuff. A lot of the time, we go into classrooms, we try and learn stuff there, and it's great. There's a lot of learning you can do there, but you need to go off and learn stuff yourself. Second one is people like telling stories and they like listening to stories. So if you really want to persuade someone, maybe rather than just fighting on the internet or whatever, a lot of the time making stories is kind of the way to do it. And there's sort of two subparts of this. First of all, is showing off is good. Now, a lot of this audience here is going to be Irish people. We don't show off that much. So in some ways, it's okay to go out there and put yourself out there in a way that maybe I wouldn't have to explain this to Americans. And the other thing is putting something out there, making something, even if it's not perfect, is much better than just waiting for something perfect because you never actually put it out there then. Okay. Now, the fancy way of putting that is when you're trying to learn, there's a thing called Bloom's taxonomy. And you have to have sort of each layer before you can go up a layer of things you're learning. You need to have basic concepts and facts before you can get the next layer of like understanding. So you need to be able to memorize stuff and know the basic definitions, first of all. Once you've done that, you need to be able to sort of discuss, explain, talk about how ideas relate. And then sometimes we move up into apply, implement, execute, solve problems. And if you're lucky, that's kind of where school kind of finishes. Sometimes they get into analyze or whatever, but usually if your school is getting you to the point where you can do, certainly in the hard subjects, you can do the actual problems, it's kind of where they leave you. And my argument today is to go up the next levels of learning, you have to be able to analyze, to be able to discuss, to critique, to evaluate, and even to create stuff. You kind of need to be doing that yourself. So this is a way to encourage people who are interested in data, interested in stories, to try and move yourself up those last few steps of the pyramid. Okay, that's a slightly technical way. But my point here is if you're lucky, undergraduate in college, certainly in school, you get the top 3.5 in a technical subject. And the next 3, if you're doing a project, you might learn something about, critiquing and stuff, but it's kind of up to you a lot of the time. Okay. You learn if you try to actively do things. This can be problems. Sitting there passively in a lecture, I think people realize now is never going to, make you an expert at things. Graphs are a great way for this kind of learning of creating things yourself because the problems are small. Here's a new kind of graph I don't know how to make. Let me make it. Here's a data set I don't know how to analyze. Get it, spend an hour trying to chop it up and get it into the right format. It's done. It's small little problems that don't take a huge amount of time. And because of that, I think graphs are a great way to learn a lot of data analysis skills because every time you sit down for an hour, you can learn a new thing and come out with something to show off at the end. Another thing is, if you're in college, a lot of the time, you'll just get something red marked. The lecturer has an awful lot of things to mark. Red line through is unclear. Whereas if you put something up online, plenty of people are going to tell you what you did wrong. And you've got to learn from them because a lot of them know an awful lot of stuff. Okay. So, in an actual example, I'm going to go through one graph I made, how it got popular, why it got popular, what happened. And then after that, I'll explain just the basic process of making graphs. Okay. So this graph got published in the Journal of General Internal Medicine under the title of Temporal Trends in Loudest Music. It had a few stories in newspapers like Forbes and stuff about it. And then also it went on and got the 3rd prize in the 2019 Scientific Plotting Contest. So it's a really interesting competition for graphs made in actual published papers, and they sort of publish the best one. It's really worth going on to the John Hunter Prize and having a look at the different entries because there's some fascinating stuff in there. Okay, so paper published, won a prize, but how was the graph actually made? Because that's kind of showing you the sausage, but not the sausage factory, if you know what I mean. Okay, so people make graphs and put them out there. If you look on Twitter, if you look on different places I'll talk about, there's plenty of great graphs. And I saw this graph. What this graph shows is how often during a day people are doing certain things. So later in the day is along the x-axis, different sports are on the y-axis. People do yoga late in the day. People do martial arts earlier in the day. People do weightlifting first thing in the morning and later on in the day. Some tasks people play pool kind of only late at night, dancing only late at night, but some tasks happen all over the day. So the idea is the thicker the hill, the more people are doing it at that time. So I saw this graph, I hadn't seen it before. I went, oh, that's an interesting graph. I must put it in my Rolodex of graphs I've remembered, if you know what I mean. Okay. So I said, oh, wait, next time I see a data set that I can do something with, I'll try and copy that graph. So I saw this data set of how long songs stayed in the Billboard Top 100. I made a graph, put it on Reddit. Wasn't very popular, wasn't very good, but I knew how to make that graph. I'd learned how to make that graph myself. So even though the graph itself wasn't good, I'd learned a new skill. And once you learn a new skill, you never know when you're going to use it again. Okay. And then I saw this data set put up on Twitter called the Million Song Data Set. And this was a visualization it's got a million different songs and various different, their length and the number of beats per minute, loads of really fascinating information. Now, I don't understand what this graph is saying. I've looked at it loads, I still don't get it. But I went, oh, that's an interesting data set. There's a million songs and all sorts of kinds of data about them. I must remember that. Remember building up a set of skills of knowing graphs you can make and building up sort of a Rolodex of, oh, here's data sets I know about in case a question pops into my head about something. Okay. So I went along and I started making the new graph I kind of knew how to make now, joy plots, and this data set and the different columns in it. So this was like, oh, wait, our song's getting faster, more beats per minute. Not that interesting. The tempo seems to be going up slightly. And you can see at the bottom there, modern songs, they seem to be slow songs and fast songs, two distinct humps. But, it's relatively interesting, but it's not that interesting. There we are. Right? Modern songs, there's slow songs and fast songs, more so than they used to be. Okay. So I made up some of these graphs, put them up on Twitter, got some advice back. Oh, I think you've made this wrong, you've thought about this. Great stuff. People, there's plenty of experts out there who will give you their opinion. Sometimes you want to ignore it, sometimes you don't, but you really get a lot of feedback in a way, in school, maybe you don't quite get. If you put your stuff out there, loads of experts will tell you what they might do different. Okay. So then I made, loudness. That's an interesting section. Loudness is sort of a technical definition here. It's not quite the same as what we mean in everyday speech. But I made this graph, stuck it up on Twitter, on Reddit, and it got really popular. And loads of people were saying this is wrong, and that's fine. But 40,000 people saw it and upvoted it, and they found it interesting that when things were on records in the old days, the loudness wasn't, the jarringness wasn't quite so much, and that seems to have increased over time. Okay, so there's a story. Put it in the title. Music has gotten louder. Hit them over the head with the title, help them interpret it. They're getting a new kind of graph that displays an awful lot of information. You kind of have to help people a bit to show them what you're doing. I shared the code. I always share my code. Bad code that works, I think, is a lot better than no code. And someone can come along then, take it, remix it. A lot of the time, someone will go, oh, here's a simpler way to do that big, long-winded thing you've done, and you learn something. Another weird thing is when you put the code up on GitHub, you can find it again later. I have a million projects on my hard drive that I've started and not finished, and I'm looking for it and I can't remember it. Whereas any of the graphs I've made, here's the graph, here's the code, here's what it looks like, and I just find it much easier to find later than looking through a hard drive trying to find what word did I use there, this sort of stuff. I'm using the language OR package here. It's like a statistics languages. I use Python in work, but what I'm talking about here applies to any particular programming language. It's nothing about any particular language. And one reason to do this is it looks good in your CV. A lot of CVs are, I'm interested in this, I'm interested in that. Whereas you can actually say, look, here's some pictures I made. Go here, look at this. Here's my GitHub. You have, over the course of an hour or two, you can make one new thing that someone can see, maybe 3 hours, whatever. You can make something that people can see, and that's kind of good on your CV. I think that shows that you're interested in doing stuff for yourself. Anyway. Okay. So now this is the sort of, that's what I did in this one case. Made a graph, stuck it on Reddit, it got popular, turned into a paper, got a third prize and a few quid. It's kind of interesting. But here's just the steps to do to make a graph. Actually, no, here's the mindset, and after this I'll go to the actual physical steps. So everyone is interested in something. Music, football, soccer, GAA, dance, all sorts of stuff. Dating, people have a lot of data about themselves now, about their Fitbit or whatever. And people find this interesting, and they have questions like, do I do more exercise on a Saturday or a Sunday? These sorts of questions people have. If there's certain things that I find commonly questions come up, something's really popular in the news, and you say to yourself, has that changed over time? Has car accidents gotten worse or better? These sorts of things. When something's in the news and this is really important, you go, is it really important? Is it, bigger or smaller than it seems to be? Are car accidents as bad as they think, or just because they're in the news, do we think they're worse? Cliches are a great one, particularly in sport. You know, is is a penalty? How often a penalty is given? Is a goal scored before halftime better or worse than scored at some other time? These sorts of cliches, there's loads of them, and if you start looking for them and start looking for data sets that can answer them, they really come up an awful lot. Okay, so keep an eye out for those sorts of questions, and if you're interested in an area, they will pop up all the time. Now, once you have your eye out and once you have those sort of questions, you need to get data, you need to make or get code, get some feedback. Those 3 steps, you'll start improving really rapidly if you go out there and make these sort of graphs. Okay. Data. Plenty of good places to get data. Kaggle was like a machine learning competition site, but even though if you're not trying to get the most accurate model or whatever, you can get the data and analyze it yourself and just make pictures of it. That's fine. Governments now, Irish government is actually really good at this for producing data sets. Fingal in particular has sort of really great data sets of all sorts of information. You can get data from published papers, but it tends to be quite difficult to search them. You have to be quite interested in an area before you'll have to sort of know that a certain paper will have the right data. There are Reddit communities or data sets where people just go, look, here's an interesting data set. I put it up there. Go there, search for an area, and you quite often find, look, someone has a data set on marathon times by age or something like this. Google have a new data set search. It's okay. And I find searching in English is very easy. But in this example, I was trying to help someone with Chinese, and it's almost impossible to search in a language you don't speak. So for you to search, if you don't speak Swedish, for you to search the Swedish government website can be really difficult. The normal sort of translation tools don't work. So frequently for those sorts of things, you need to get help from someone who's a native speaker. That's just my experience. Okay. So once you have your questions, which I think everyone does once you start looking for it, and you have your, right, where am I going to get data? Where am I going to look for data? The next thing is, where do I get a sort of a Rolodex, a bunch of visualizations I know, and I can wheel them out whenever a question arises that's appropriate for it. The standard ones are taught in visualization books. I'll describe some of them a bit later. They're good. You need to know your bar charts and your scatter plots and everything. So even if you just go out and you learn those, that's the first several steps in the journey. So that's fine. And even if all you do is, most of the graphs I'm showing here can be shown pretty well as just a bar chart or a scatter plot. And that's kind of fine until you move on to the next step, which is fine. There's a great website called Or Bloggers where they collect different examples of how, almost always with code, of how to make particular examples. Go there, have a look, go down a rapid path of a particular topic. You'll see lots of great examples of code there. There is on Twitter certain hashtags people use. Tidy Tuesday is a great one where they give out a data set. On last week was cricket scores. People made really interesting graphs and shared the code how to make it. So Tidy Tuesday is really worth looking at, particularly if you're into OR package. There's examples. There's a Reddit subreddit called Data is Beautiful. It's really popular, and if you go there and just look at the popular searches and just subscribe if you're in Reddit anyway, and just keep looking at them, you learn something. There's something, I haven't seen that kind of graph before, it comes along. And an interesting one, by the way, is historical books. There's all sorts of books, even from Ireland, from the 1800s, of sort of graphs that we don't use now and types. And it's just really interesting to see what they thought was interesting then, why, and you can do a comparison again. Railroads in 1900 versus railroads today in Ireland. It's an interesting visualization, but you only kind of remember to look at that if you see the old book. So anyway, it's just, if you're interested in history books, it's always worth looking at the visuals. Okay, where to show off? I was given an example here for people in China and stuff. Realistically, it's LinkedIn. When you make a graph, stick it on LinkedIn. You never know if someone's going to be interested. It's not a great place for getting feedback or anything, but it just keeps something up there. Reddit, I find great. Lots of great advice you get there. You can show your friends on Facebook or whatever, but the main point here is I don't think it's bad to show off. had an interesting question to you, you've made a graph that tells a story about it, go stick it up. And if people give out or whatever, it's fine, So books to read. I'll share this slideshow later, but there's a Kieran Healy, an Irish author, who did a great ggplot2 book, so I'd recommend that. Visualize This is it's a slightly older book, but what I like about it is it gets across lots of weird ideas, so it kind of opens up your mind to, oh look, there's lots of kind of graphs out there, lots of kind of questions. Flowing Data is an internet site for years, and they have really nice visualizations. It costs a few quid to subscribe to it, but even if you just look at the free stuff until you're into it, there's great presentations there. Okay, so here's just some examples of those books. This Think Bayes book isn't a visualization book, but any book by Alan Downey, he's a Python author, they're really interesting. So, and again, I always recommend those. In terms of our package, I was the technical reviewer on this book. It's a really good book. I'm sort of glossing over some of the difficulties of chopping up data and changing around, because once you know what you want to do, it doesn't tend to be that hard. But a book like this can really sort of speed you up, because they'll have sort of recipes for doing certain tasks that you do commonly, and it'll sort of show you the right way to do it. Okay. People will give you advice. People will moan. Most 90% of the time, they're right. It's worth listening to and learning. I was just explaining this. The expression is the hurler on the ditch. You just ignore the bad comments. I don't do it. I get annoyed by them, but you shouldn't. It's much better to produce something, put something out there, than be the hurler on the ditch, just giving out all the time. So ignore it, even if I don't, Anyway, the actual steps to make a visualization here. This is sort of called the grammar of graphics in the sort of technical terms, but it's mainly just you go through these steps and you'll end up with something. And because you know the path, I find this much easier. It's like, oh, right, I'm on step 3 now. After that is step 4. I don't have to panic. It's just, that, I'll eventually at the end of this have something okay-ish. So anyway, here's the steps. First of all, find the data. From the example area, it was the million song data set, and there was columns in it that were interesting. So find the data set, select the certain columns, maybe group them together, this sort of stuff. But that's kind of almost in many ways the hardest bit. Okay, make a simple graph. Once you've got the data kind of in the format you like, make a line graph, make a scatter plot, make a bar chart. That's fine. Realistically, at this point, you're nearly done. You know what I mean? Once you've got the data in a decent format, that's an awful lot of the work. Okay, so you've made a graph. The data looks the kind of the way you want it to look. It's in the nice format. Make a version of your graph that you want to make, but ugly. So here I've made a joy plot, and it's not right. It's, the X and the Y axis are kind of wonky, and there's a few things in it. But you have now, I have the data. The data is in the right format. I have a kind of a graph. Great, nearly there. I'm 3 of the 7 steps in, and I'm nearly there. You know what I mean? You add the access, the labels, the titles, these sorts of things to it. If you remember this is a step, it's very quick to do, but it can be easy to sort of panic and just, once you do this, like, oh, everything's starting to look a bit clearer already, and that only took me 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Grand. Other tweaks. There's always something, this looks a bit wrong, this looks a bit wrong. Can I make this axis smaller or bigger? And these sorts of tweaks come along, and that's fine. And just know that there's a step here where you go, right, I need to group this together better. These sorts of things happen, and that's okay. That's the clean things up a bit stage. Step 6, I'm nearly there. Great. Okay. Color. Color can really make a graph pop out, be really nice. There's lots of different guides to how to make good colors. I'm not good at it. It's something I need to improve. But remember, you're on the web. It's not like you're printing to a black and white book anymore. You can use color, and you should use color. It really helps the graphics look better. Anyway, so went through those steps and ended up with a final paper, and turned out that graph was popular. But none of the steps there were rocket science. Every step there was like, oh, that's easy. There's the expression of book I'm reading at the moment, which is what one idiot can do, another idiot can do. So if I can do it, any of you can do it. Do you know what I mean? So that sounded insulting when I said it that way, but you know what I mean. Then, when you know a particular kind of graph, this joy plot that comes from the first picture earlier, which was a Irish woman, an astronomer, she discovered quasars, and that was the graph that they used to discover quasars. So there's been an update called a rain cloud plot that shows you sort of individual parts of the data, and it's an interesting thing. It's, again, once you know joy plots, you can move on to rain cloud plots really easy. It's a new kind of it. Great, learned a new thing. This here was by genre. I happen to have a data set of genre, and I could use the same sort of data. Okay. I make other graphs. I'm just going to show them here now, just to sort of put some other ideas in your head. I'm just showing one graph. A lot of the graphs I make are on climate change. We need to make lots of graphs on climate change just to explain the story. One graph won't, explain it all. There's plenty of data from Ireland going back quite far. Other countries goes back even further. There's lots of data out there to look at and make pictures with. Here's one to just the average temperature. Yeah, so in England, for instance, they have data for daily temperature going back to, I think it's 1750 or something like that. It's a long time. So you can do these sort of comparisons over a long time period. Anyway, thank you very much for listening. My point there was, you have questions. There's plenty of data out there. There's lots of examples of code that you can sort of take the code, copy it yourself. You will eventually start making changes. And if you go through this step, quite rapidly, you'll build up a set of tools about manipulating data, making graphics, and things you can show off. You can show a potential employer, oh, wait, look, I made this graph, and this is why it's interesting, and I can talk about it. And I think that's a really useful thing to do, and I think graphs are a great way to get into data analysis. So, yeah, that's today. Thank you very much.